All right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you decide to access this presentation. I sent an email that shared with you the overall big picture for test results and overall excellent job, 16 A's out of the 26 that took the test. There are a number of B's that were right on the edge of bumping up to 90%. So I wanted to pick up where we left off. That's where we're going to begin our next unit of study. And the chapter that we're on in OpenStax, we're ending the chapter, but we haven't ended it yet. So we are at the end. And so we're going to be talking specifically about some of the issues with the working class and their responses to some of the things that we've been talking about. Before we get to that, though, I hope that you guys are remembering that if you signed up to take the AP test, that in May you're going to be doing just that. The first week of May, May 4th, May 5th, I believe. May 5th is the date for the national test for U.S. history. And at the beginning of the school year, I shared with you these themes. And I haven't come back to these themes, but as you head toward May, it is very important that you review these, especially as we start to do some prep work for extended response essay questions that are DBQs using multiple documents. And the professional graders, the teachers that they hire to grade these essays, open-ended responses, they are looking for certain things. We're going to work on developing killer thesis statements, but one of the other things that is an automatic point along with developing a strong thesis is including documents or the questions that are being asked. And so, again, I would encourage you to be familiar with these themes: the American and national identity, work exchange and technology, geography and the environment, migration and settlement, politics and power, America in the world, America. All right. So again, we're going to hit some training that's specific to developing solid document-based question expanded responses, because I want my APUSH students to be able to push it real good. Push it real good. That's APUSH. Push it real good. Push it real good. So that's the ultimate goal, to push it real good when it comes to the test in May. All right, so today, in the time that we have, recall working class conditions in the inner cities. We talked about factories. We talked about the tenement houses that often were provided for workers, and how these tenement slums were just bare minimum. And we talked about why you would have multiple generations or extended family living in these tenement flats because they were working 6 days a week. They were working 15, 18-hour days. And if you recall, poverty line was around $600 a year in order to keep a roof over your head, clothes on your back, and food on the table. But even though you're working 6 days a week and 18-hour days, you're not bringing home enough to, to pay the bills. And so you've got Uncle Joe and Uncle Bob living with you. Mom's taking in outside work. She's taking care of the kids, doing laundry for wealthier folks. And these are the facts of life. Of course, Dad is gone working in incredibly difficult environments when we are in the progressive era and talking about Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, but we're not quite there yet. We're getting close. And then, of course, child labor. Again, kids are not in school. Kids are working in the factories because the family is trying to survive. So, obviously, these aren't the best of conditions. And so, what do? Well, as an unskilled laborer, if you complain to your boss about working conditions or pay or the apartment that you're renting from him, any complaint is an unskilled laborer and you're fired. So it's easy to replace you. You don't have a marketable skill. You're just doing the same slice on the cow as it is hoisted over you, heading down the meat packing assembly line. Anybody can learn to do that particular cut, right? But what if the 500 people on the floor, all unskilled laborers, decide to walk off the job, right? That's a little bit more difficult for management and factory owners to deal with. So what we call this is organized labor, right? You're going to organize into labor unions. And so on the next test, the first concept you need to understand is the significance of the Knights of Labor. This is the first labor union that organized in the United States. It's called the Knights of Labor. They organized in 1869, but they, as we are going to see shortly, are going to die a fairly quick death. Now, Samuel Gompers is going to be an individual who will probably be on your AP test. He was a labor leader at the time, and he was involved heavily in trying to develop policy and agitate and also put pressure on the powers that be, whether they're local or national, to bring about changes. He is going to be instrumental in a group that is called the American Federation of Labor. It's gone through a number of name changes and it's known by different things, but the American Federation of Labor is another important concept for the test and just for understanding American history, and that they are the longest existing labor union. They've gone through name changes, but as an institution, the American Federation of Labor has been around in some form since 1881. It's still alive and well today. If you've heard of the Teamsters, the AFL-CIO, those are all synonyms for this group. A friend of mine who worked at UPS back in the 80s and early 90s in college, in order to be employed at UPS at the time, and I don't know if that's changed, you had to be a member of the union. So he was a member of the AFL-CIO. He was a member of the Teamsters, not because he wanted to be, but because he had to be. It was a closed shop. The laws have changed in Oklahoma, and we are a right-to-work state, which means you are not compelled to join a labor union. And again, these two labor unions are not the only labor unions, but these are the only two that you need to worry about for me, and I believe they're pretty significant. The American Federation of Teachers, that's another labor union. essentially you can find labor unions, Major League Baseball Players Association. If you listen to sports radio, Jim Traber will tell you that is probably the strongest labor union in the United States in terms of solidarity. So anyway, what are these labor unions organizing for? Well, they want to try to bring about two things: a standardized workday and a living wage. That is their goal. Again, those things don't sound strange, they don't sound radical, but it's going to be a fight. And in fact, it's a fight that they will lose. History class, the other students that are in history but not taking it through AP, we're in the Great Depression, 1930s. That's when this goal is finally achieved. It takes the Depression for labor unions to see what was their original goal achieved. So it's going to be a long time because we're still in the 1800s. It's another 50 years before a standardized work day or week is codified, and there is a concept of a minimum wage established. One of the other distinctions: Knights of Labor, unskilled laborers. Anybody's welcome to join. Male, female, race, anybody's welcome. The AFL is a little worker. You had to have a marketable skill that required an apprenticeship, training, like an electrician, things along this line. You just go through a process to get certifications or credentials, and so you have a valuable skill that you can't just walk in day one and start working. It's a process. So we're going to be focusing on Chicago, and it becomes somewhat, I guess, the epicenter for some really significant incidents. And to understand a little bit about Chicago at the time, if you go back to pre-Civil War era, there were about 100,000 people living there. So it's a sizable city. Great location, sitting on the southern tip of Lake Michigan in northern Illinois. But if you recall, Stephen Douglas orchestrated the railroad coming through Illinois before it headed west to California. And so once the Transcontinental Railroad was established, Chicago becomes a transportation hub. It's centrally located. It's got access to ultimately the Atlantic Ocean through the canal systems of the Great Lakes. So with the train, now you're talking about an incredible growth, right? And again, I'm not going to ask you specifically how big Chicago grew, but definitely understand that it's exponential. In 40 years, this city went from 100,000 to over 1 million people. And the overwhelming majority of these people were not Americans, Native Americans, natural-born citizens. They were foreigners. In fact, the biggest minority group in terms of immigrants in Chicago were Polish people. And there are actually more people at this time in Chicago were Polish than lived in Warsaw, Poland, which was the capital of Poland. So it's a very ethnically diverse place. And if you recall, well, I guess we haven't gotten there yet. We go through these periods where there's heavy immigration, and then there's always resistance to that. Primarily, people concerned about economics and wages being undercut and things like that. So there's a lot of animosity that immigrants will face, particularly in this time period. So that's a little background about Chicago. So Chicago, what's called Haymarket Square, and this is, I guess, similar. The way I would compare it, and I don't know if you guys have this connection or not, but if you go down to Bricktown and the canal and it's kind of expanded southward towards the what used to be the Canadian River, that's now the Oklahoma River, and the Entertainment District. But before Bricktown in downtown Oklahoma City was an entertainment district, it was actually a warehouse district. The train rolled in, things were loaded and unloaded, so those are all factory warehouses down there. Today they're restaurants and trendy shops and things like that. But this is what Haymarket Square was on a larger scale. It's the factory and warehouse district of Chicago. So 1886 is very important in that organized labor has come up with a plan, and they had two goals: a standardized workday and a living wage. And if those goals were not met by May 1st of 1886, then there was going to be a nationwide strike. This strike was not just Chicago. It was across the nation. Organized labor union members were going to walk off the job on May 1st, 1886. And so May 1st rolls around, 1886, and across America, thousands of people walked off their jobs. And again, it was multiple states. But the reason that we're focusing on Chicago is because it got violent. So here's their demand: 8 hours a day, 10 hours pay, kind of a nice little advertisement promoting their cause. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. So a standardized workday and a living wage.